Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Horus Heresy lore breakdown. We are still on book number 11, Fallen Angels. Last time we had a look at the Dark Angels. The Lion had just defended Diamat, a Forge World, against a minor raiding party made up primarily of second-line troops from the War Master's army. These resources were expected to be used in fortifying Istvan against the inevitable retaliation of the Loyalists. The Lion had successfully defeated this first strike and was now awaiting the second one, which he was entirely sure would be arriving quite shortly. Meanwhile, Zahariel back on Caliban are fighting gigantic worm thingies. Reaver worms, to be precise. Apparently, Calibanite children used to hunt these monstrosities as children, and they only grew to be about half a meter long. Wow. No problems then, I guess. I mean, they're just gargantuan monster worms that kill things, then take over their central nervous system and wander them back home to their hive to be devoured by their queen. Entirely reasonable creatures. And definitely something that children should be hunting from a very young age. This is why nobody wants to live in 40k. It's just a really terrible place. And naturally, gigantuan monster worms that create zombies is just the beginning. Last time I mentioned that these creatures were clearly of Caliban origin, and the creature that they found at the bottom of the thermal vent, a oversized queen variant of the Reaver worm, that was definitely not natural. Clearly Calibanite, but also very much so unnatural. Which means that the only conclusion one can draw is that no, these monstrous zombie-creating worm fuckers are most definitively not something that Mother Nature is responsible for. After a brief fight, Zahariel's squad manages to kill the giant queen with a single severe casualty and wipe out her little broodlings. Broodlings that, by the way, had started to inhabit all of the various corpses of the people that had lived at the station and had come to rescue it, all piled up high around the thermal station. Well, at least now they know what happened to the rescue squad and the local, so that's good. Of course, it still leaves the minor issue that Caliban's fauna appears to be directly created by chaos, which is very bad. Granted, Zahariel wouldn't necessarily have a firm grasp on what chaos is and how bad it is, but he most definitively knows that planets have been burned for considerably less than this. And what does an entrepreneuring Dark Angel do when he is faced with an uncomfortable truth? He fucking buries it. Because they're Dark Angels, and they're cunts. Zahariel orders his aerial support to plaster the entire goddamn area, burying the thermal vent and all of the corpses, along, of course, with the gargantuan Reaver worm queen. He would report to Luther, and only to Luther, because once again, planets have been burned for considerably less. And of course, the next port of call in any good old-fashioned cover-up is finding a scapegoat. Naturally. Zahariel summoned a meeting with Luther, himself, Israfel, the chief librarian of the Dark Angels, and Chapter Master Astalan, who had accompanied Zahariel. He informed Luther of his findings and informed him also of his hypothesis that Caliban might have been tainted from the very get-go, and that the taint at this point ran so deep that it had become inextricably a part of Caliban's natural order. And then the conversation takes a very interesting direction. So, naturally, somebody has to be responsible for this ritual. They then make the assumption that the ritual was of quite some complexity, which possibly, but not surely. However, the uprising to kill the garrison, that would have required a fair bit of planning. Zahariel then suggests that the ritual and the planned action must have been devised somewhere else. He also informs Luther that on their scanners they picked up a civilian shuttle heading towards the North Wilds Arcology just before they arrived. He also states that the Terran engineers that were supposed to be working at the plants were not amongst the corpses. And since everybody else was dead, the only natural assumption was that whoever was aboard that shuttle leaving the site must have also been the perpetrators. A reasonable enough assumption. But then they start making some assumptions that are considerably less reasonable. Luther leaps on this idea and postulates that they will have to check every single installation that has had Terran engineering support since their arrival. Israfel is not too pleased by this idea and suggests that what Luther is saying is essentially tantamount to accusing every single Terraner or off-worlder of being in some way corrupted. Luther responds by asking Israfel to show him a single Calibanite that has been corrupted. This right after admitting that Caliban has had a long tradition of burning witches and mutants. I think there's your answer, Luther. Your planet has a long history of corruption within its people. However, that corruption was kept in check by the somewhat barbaric nature of the local population, in this case entirely correct, yes, but still a little bit vicious. But with the coming of the Imperium, some of this may have changed. The Imperium brought with it far more of an advanced culture, far more of an enlightened view on things, including, to some degree, the acceptance of psyches and, to some limited capacity, mutants. Whether or not enough time had passed to really see this starting to take a hold again is more unclear, but Luther's flat-out rejection that there could be anything wrong with the Calibanite people seems idiotic, frankly, and fueled more by the desperate wish to deny the corruption that seems so inherently linked to Caliban than anything else. Luther also has himself a little outburst against Israfel, stating that before the Imperium came, there were no rebellions on Caliban, there was no taint. He seems mildly delusional, as if the words spoken to him on the landing pad by the rebel leaders have really gotten to him, as if he is starting to wonder whether or not he is failing Caliban, and whether or not his true loyalty lies with the Imperium or somewhere else. He also orders that all Dark Angel forces on Caliban be made ready for war. All of the Astartes that have been standing idly by at a relatively low level of readiness during weeks of increasingly intense rebel activity are now suddenly all put onto a war footing. It would appear that Luther's previous reservations have now simply all melted away, now that he has a new target to aim his Astartes at. Subsequent raids and investigation revealed the identity of the engineers that should have been on site. Unfortunately, their dormitories had been destroyed in one of the early phases of the rebellion. Yet another fortuitous coincidence, isn't it? The Dark Angels just managed to pick up a ship on their scanners, heading towards the Northwild archaeology. The Dark Angels did not find a single corpse of any of the engineers on site. They were very careful in covering their tracks, yet they are heading straight home to the archaeology, just as the Dark Angels arrive, hours after they would have completed their task. And their original residences have been conveniently destroyed by the rebellion. Additionally, any further documentation pertaining to where they had been evacuated to after their old quarters were destroyed have also been conveniently destroyed themselves, meaning that the only place they can be in, and indeed the only hint that the Dark Angels have, is that one single ship heading towards the Northwild's archaeology. This is all awfully convenient, isn't it? And yet, the First Legion doesn't have much in the way of a choice other than going on what they already have. Luther has decided against informing the wider Imperium, and Magos Bosk in particular, about the real reason why they glassed her industrial complex. This pissed her off to no end, unfucking surprisingly, but Luther was able to prevail upon the Magus to not report this to her superiors, which must have been quite the argument. After this, Luther sequestered himself away somewhere in a secret location, which only Lord Cypher knew about. Zahariel had prevailed upon Lord Cypher to send dozens of messages to Luther asking for clarifications and guidance as to what he was supposed to do now, but Luther had not answered a single one of them. Zahariel was considering ordering the Astartes chapters into the North Wales archaeology to clear it level by level, a task that had proven to be beyond the Jaeger's capabilities, as the archaeology was also apparently infested by rebels, but whilst he technically had the authority to do so, it would be going against Luther's wishes, something Zahariel was not too fond of doing. So instead he decided to have a quick chat with a bunch of Xeno's monstrosities that he knows next to nothing about. The Watchers in the Dark. Natürlichen. After all, what could possibly go wrong in seeking the advice of a bunch of alien monster thingamabobs you know next to nothing about and whose motives are even less known? Oh well. At this point, Zahariel has more or less been pushed into a motherfucking corner, so I guess you can't blame him too much. And the Watchers did give him some answers, although not great ones. They state that the reason why the Calibanite people were not affected by the taint that rested so deep in Caliban was partially due to their efforts, and partially due to the great beasts, who are indeed manifestations of chaotic monstrosities. Remarkably placid manifestations, mind you, seeing as, generally speaking, these things would be running rampant across the entire planet, butchering and killing and murdering and raping and all of the things that bring their masters powers. But I suppose the intervention of the Watchers in the Dark is what perhaps kept them to a relatively localized area, relatively speaking. And so, of course, with the Lion's extermination of the great beasts, and the subsequent arrival of the Imperium clearing out the forests, these creatures had long since been wiped out. And, of course, with the exploitation of the planet came the establishment of new mining complexes, many of which buried deep into areas they should not have burrowed in. Just the simple removal of the forest seems to have also impacted the stability of the world quite drastically. Perhaps the Watchers in the Dark somehow used the forest as a weapon against the great beasts. Perhaps using them to hem them in or in some way focus their powers. Either way, the disappearance of the forest and the establishment of various imperial businesses has clearly had the exact opposite effect. We've got ourselves a neat division of blame here then. On one hand, the Imperium and their unchecked exploitation of the planet is certainly to blame. Then again, the Imperium had no idea that what they were doing was going to have an adverse effect on Caliban, because when they arrived, the planet seemed perfectly fine. There wasn't a whole lot of psychers running around, and the giant monstrosities were pretty much all dead. As such, they saw no real reason to continue investigating. Plus, this was the planet of a Primarch, and you don't question the loyalty or purity of such places without damn good reasons. Another fairly hefty part of the blame has to be put upon the Dark Angels themselves, and more specifically, Luther and the Lion, who wiped out the great beasts, again, granted, not knowing what they were doing. The third portion of the blame then has to land on the motherfucking little bastards in the Cabal. The Watchers in the Dark knew this was going to happen. They knew the reason why this was going to happen, and they knew it was inevitable. They even took on a human quote-unquote ally in the form of Zahariel, so they clearly aren't that human-hating, and yet they sat by and fucking waited until shit hit the fan at supersonic velocity. And now, here they are going, well, you wouldn't understand. Oh, try me, says Zahariel. Oh, okay, the monsters are based on chaos, and chaos is bad. And Zahariel goes like, yeah, I understand perfectly. That's not even hard, you little shit stains. Why didn't you tell me this earlier, you filthy little robe-wearing fuckwits? Or at least, that should have been his response. And of course, blame also falls on the rebels, seeing as even with the Imperium's exploitation, all of the nastiness was relatively dormant, it was laying low. Then, people started dying in considerable quantities, primarily due to the rebellion, and as we all know, chaos is very fond of, well, chaos, discontent, murder, and those sort of things. Now, which one of these can Zahariel actually do something about? The Imperium? No, because he'd have to inform them that the planet was tainted, which they might overreact to, rather violently. Could he do something about the Watchers in the Dark being giant fucking idiots? No, that was also going to be rather difficult. Could he bring the great beasts back to life? Nope, that one was also going to be quite the feat to accomplish. So the only possibility then was trying to stop the fighting. On one hand, he could try and order his own troops to stop fighting. He did, technically speaking, have the authority, at the very least over the Astartes, but whether or not he could pull the reins of the Jaeger regiments, well, that's a bit more unclear, and it would also raise a lot of eyebrows in the Imperial delegation, which would almost certainly then start phoning home rather furiously. The only option then was trying to get a hold of the rebellion. Luckily, he knew just the guy, Lord Cypher, the same person who had facilitated the previous parley. If he could get him to set up a deal with the rebel leaders in the North Wales arcology, then maybe he could secure a ceasefire with them for long enough for the two parties to cooperate and hunt down whoever had committed the rituals, therefore, hopefully, buying some time. And speaking of buying time, for the sake of suspense, we are now going to pop on back to Diomet, where the Lion has a very special mission for Nemiel. It turns out that the Lion was not entirely trusting of his new allies, although, despite that, he does make a somewhat strange decision. He suspects that Magos Archoi is hiding something from him, or possibly, he simply doesn't know about it. He has received the list of inventories from the Magos, except they are missing some very important things that the Lion knows are on the planet, but he can't be 100% sure that the Magos actually knows they exist. They are massive siege artillery combat platforms, think gargantuan monster Baneblade tanks essentially, that were commissioned from the Forge World on Horus's order 150 years ago. Now, clearly, this is a while, so it wouldn't be entirely unusual for them to simply forget about them, or overlook them. After all, Magus Archoi had only become the acting Chief Magus very, very recently. It was not beyond the realms of possibility that the previous Magus had known about them and had simply kept them a secret, and since he got his brains blown out, he would have had a rather hard time telling his successor about them. This is all possible. It could simply have been forgotten or not listed properly, but let's be honest here, the Mechanicus doesn't really forget anything, ever. And the idea that the second-in-command would not be aware of 6 or 8 massively devastating weapons being stored there also seems rather unusual, something that the Lion must have thought of as well. Nevertheless, he decides to allow the Mechanicus to implement their Skitarii and Praetorian units within the rest of the surviving forces, including, of course, the Governor's Dragoons and his own Astartes. That is a damn high-trust move for somebody you just met. Not only is he going to be allowing the Mechanicus to fight alongside them, but for them to embed their units within their own. That is a very strange and somewhat out-of-character move, especially for the First Legion. The Dark Angels aren't exactly famed for their open and acceptive nature, now are they? Anywho, he had his misgivings, and so ordered Nemiel and his favoured squad to head down to the Mechanicus Forge complex where the weapons were supposed to be stored. Incidentally, this was also a part of the Forge complex that had supposedly seen heavy fighting, and was also the location where the previous Chief Magos had fallen in defense of the complex. However, when Nemiel arrived, there was no signs of combat whatsoever, except for one area in which it appeared that several individuals had been killed at close range. Individuals whose internals were mixed up between various types of mechanical and organic components. This is odd then. No signs of combat, and what appears to be a bunch of Mechanicus personnel practically executed at point-blank range. How was it that Archoi said that the Chief Magos had been killed again? In the fighting? No, he didn't say that. He just said he'd been killed. He never mentioned by whom. Well then, it looks like we have ourselves a little bit of a murder mystery here, with a rather obvious suspect. For some reason, however, Nemiel decides to not call home and inform the Lion about this, which seems like a rather terrible idea. Granted, in their current location, their communication might be picked up, but Surely, with the information that one of your allies might be compromised, and allies whose formations are already embedded in your own formations, the right thing would be to send one of the Astartes back so that he could return to orbit and tell Daddy what's up. Because this information, if it should prove reliable, seems far too vital. And even if it proved unreliable, the Lion has no need to act upon this immediately. All he needs to do is inform his Astartes to keep a bit of a distance from the Mechanicus and keep an eye on them. Maybe try to unentangle them from the Dragoons, for example. Nothing overt needs to be done, and surely the risk of not doing anything would be considerably larger than doing something. But yet, Nemiel decided that he had to be sure before bringing this news to his Primarch, and his original mission, of course, was to locate the weapons. Not technically necessarily to warn his Primarch of impending betrayal. It does sound like a slightly too rigid way of thinking, in my opinion, but hey, details. So, how then would they go about procuring evidence and locating the weapons? If they weren't here, then where were they? Well, they had been in storage for 150 years, so they probably required some tuning up. What part of the planet would have the facilities and resources for such a task? As it so happens, the planet was home to a Titan Legion, which was currently off on deployment somewhere else in the galaxy, meaning that the Titan foundries were currently empty. And yet, the Titan foundries were powered up. Now, I have to ask, how the fuck did this little nugget of information sneak its way past the Dark Angels? I mean, it would seem like a rather obvious and important piece of information. Hey, there's no Titans around. How do you know? Well, can you see any fucking Titans? No? Okay then. Well, what's the point of that information then? The lights are on in their goddamn house. That's the point of that. I mean, granted, it's a relatively minor detail, but if you see the lights on in your neighbor's house that you know are on vacation, maybe you start getting a little bit suspicious, you know? Especially considering the Lion's intuitive grasp of tactics and warfare. He should be able to throw one look at a map containing all of this information and see, oh hey, the Titan foundries are online, but I don't have any Titans. Something's wrong. Could it be that there's currently a Titan or two in production? No, there's no mention of this in the manifesto, nor in the inventory that the Chief Magus gave me. Huh. How odd. Could it be that the Chief Magos, recently ascended to his position after the unfortunate death of his predecessor, might not be 100% honest with me? And maybe, just maybe, I should interrogate him again, this time with a bolt pistol. But, unfortunately, the Lion never thought to do this. You could partially excuse it by the fact that he is remarkably socially awkward, and he was clearly also very unsure about what to think about the Magos, but I really would think that his natural understanding of a tactical situation might override that, if for no other reason than the Magos seemingly maneuvering himself into an excellent tactical situation, for no real apparent reason. But at the end of the day, that is neither here nor there. He didn't suspect the Mechanicus, and Nemiel chose not to report back his suspicions so early. Rather, they went off to the Titan Foundry and found it heavily guarded by the Mechanicus. The plot thickens. Granted, there was nothing particularly unusual about the Mechanicus heavily guarding a Titan Foundry, even one that technically shouldn't currently be in operation, considering they essentially view these foundries as cathedrals. They probably would provide some form of a guard force, even if they had no nefarious intentions, though the sheer volume of security measures did look a wee bit suspicious. And whilst Nemiel and his friends infiltrate the Titan foundries, I am going to annoy you with an advertisement. Right, now that you've been successfully annoyed, let's get back to the interesting things. I was advised by YouTube to drop these whenever things were actually getting interesting, so blame them, not me. Anyways, Nemiel and his squad, after some problematic encounters with a local sentry gun, eventually managed to infiltrate the Titan Foundry complex, where they find the massive siege weapons that they were sent to look for. 6 of them to be precise. Gargantuan guns with mind interface units, the same that are used to control Titans. And the damn little fat thingies are armed almost as well as a Titan. They've got quad las cannons and mega bolter turrets scattered all over their canopies, in addition to one monstrous siege gun, what appears to be something as ridiculous as a macro cannon on a centerline mount. These things are so massive that their quadruple track chassis, 6 of them, fill up the entire maintenance yard, a yard normally used to maintain Titans. Additionally, these might not be entirely normal machines, as the now rather clearly traitorous Magos Arkoi had hung long strings of corpses above them, slowly dripping their bloody fluids down upon the machines. Now, I am no expert on mechanical maintenance, but that does not seem standard. At the very least, I've never seen them do this as my local body shop, so I'm going to assume this is something brand new and interesting that the newly founded Dark Mechanicus has come up with. Magos Arkoi himself then makes an appearance alongside one of the officers from the recently defeated raiding force, putting to rest any doubt whatsoever that he's in league with the traitors, and finally, Nemuel and friends realize that, oh shit, right, this really shady person has embedded his units in with all of ours, and oh hey look, he knows we're here. Isn't this just going wonderfully? Nemuel's immediate priority right now is to not get dead, and preferably murdering the Magus in the process, whilst also getting out and sending an emergency message to the Lion. Of course, at this point, however, it is all just a little bit too late. The Magos' plans have been laid well in advance. In fact, they were laid pretty much the very same moment that he received news that an unknown force had arrived in orbit and whooped his allies' ass. His new scheme relied upon the idea that the War Master would send reinforcements, a reasonable assumption considering the situation, and that they would arrive within a certain time. This predetermined time and date had now arrived, and all of the sleeping tech guards and Praetorians embedded within the allied units now burst into rather vicious and murderous life. The Dragoons suffered by far the worst in this surprise attack, as they had already been decimated by the previous battles, and whilst they had been able to gain some reinforcements by recruiting from amongst the local population, these were of course pretty much entirely green troops with tops 2 weeks worth of basic weapon training. In other words, they weren't exactly the steadiest of troops, and considering they were currently facing a surprise assault by Tech Guard and Praetorians, both formations which would be infinitely more experienced and vastly better equipped, yeah, they weren't likely to hold up for very long now, were they? The Astartes did a whole lot better, seeing as they were both awake, alert, and always at the ready, but even they suffered a fairly uncomfortable amount of casualties as the Praetorians embedded in their midst, giant hulking genetically modified killer monster machines, suddenly leapt into furious rage, were pumped full of all manners of fascinating chemicals, and went on a complete and utter rampage right in their midst. Even Astartes can be caught unaware by that level of sheer unbridled anger suddenly erupting right beside them. Imagine walking side by side with your girlfriend, imagining that nothing bad could ever happen, as you feel a disturbance in the Force as she receives a text message including some rather compromising information about what you did with another female not too long ago. That would be roughly the equal experience to finding yourself beside the berserk killing machine that is a Praetorian in murderfuck mode. But of course, the Magos' treachery did not limit itself merely to the ground forces. Up in orbit, the Lion's fleet suddenly found itself under attack by serious jamming. This completely blinded most of his ships, who were now communicating purely through running lights and signals. They began scanning the nearby ether to see if this was some form of enemy activity, and sure enough, they soon detected 8 enemy vessels bearing down upon them. In response, the Lion enacted his pre-planned maneuvers. The light escort ships, along with the light cruisers, would rush out first and meet the enemy. Once within weapon range, they would launch a spread of torpedoes at the incoming vessels to try and replicate the success of the previous naval engagement. However, who had supplied the torpedoes? Yes, that is precisely correct. They had come from Magos Archoy's reserves. Thusly, the moment the ships tried to launch their torpedoes, they exploded within their tubes, annihilating the smaller escort vessels and crippling the light cruisers, who now, with multiple fires raging across their gun decks, would have to disengage and try and save their ships, in the hopes that the rest of the battle line could either escape or hold firm. However unlikely that sounded, considering that the rest of the battle line now consisted of a single Dark Angel's battle barge and the Duchess Arbelitum, a single Grand Cruiser who had been practically crippled in the previous engagement. Things weren't looking particularly rosy in orbit. On the ground, things weren't looking all that much better. The Denagaran Dragoons under the Governor had, fared particularly badly. The Mechanicus forces, of course, were no longer allied with the Loyalists, leaving pretty much only the Dark Angels Astartes left. They had suffered 30 killed at the hands of the traitorous Praetorians and another 60 seriously wounded, leaving only 93 Astartes unwounded and fully operational. Nemiel and his squad had been able to extricate themselves from the Titan foundry yards and linked up with the Lion, who used their location beacon to teleport the remainder of the Dark Angels down onto the planet. They then had a meeting in the shadow of their venerable brother Dreadnought, where they stated that the situation could indeed look better. The Magos' duplicity had been well and truly revealed, not only due to the fact that all of their brand new torpedoes had mysteriously exploded, but also due to the source of the jamming signal coming from his own forges. Upon learning this, the Lion unleashed his battle barge's bombardment cannons upon said forge. 8 rounds, to be precise, which is essentially the same as dropping 8 high-yield nuclear missiles on top of it. It was well and truly flattened. That's one problem dealt with, as it undeniably also killed off a few more tech guard in the blast, but that still leaves the line with only 93 Astartes with which to defeat the incoming traitors. On the bright side, Horus had been put on a fairly strict clock by the Magos' schemings. He had to dispatch reinforcements almost immediately upon hearing of the failure of the first force. This meant that the incoming traitor formation was a very, very ad hoc one, and nowhere near as powerful as it could have been. On the other hand, whilst the incoming force was considerably weaker than it could have been, they would also make planetfall completely unscathed, due to the fact that the Lion's initial gambit in orbit had been completely crushed by the Magos' betrayal. All things being equal, the Lion had decided that any fight in orbit would be utterly goddamn pointless, since he would have 2 ships, a battle barge, and a Grand Cruiser, who was basically a floating derelict at this point, against 8 fully armed and unscathed enemy ships. As such, he had ordered the remainder of his orbital resources, including the more or less crippled light cruisers, to get the fuck out of Dodge, whilst he himself and the remainder of the Astartes in orbit would teleport down to the surface and try to hold out against the enemy. They did have a hope of incoming reinforcements from the rest of the Dark Angels Legion currently disengaging, and they also knew that Horus's forces were on a very, very tight schedule if they were to pillage the Forge's resources and make it back with anything worthwhile. So they still had a chance, although it had definitely lessened rather considerably over the last hour or so. And once again, in the name of suspense, and because there's going to have to be a 3rd episode in this Horus Heresy book, we're going to head over to Caliban once again, where Zahariel has gone to the North Wilds Archaeology under the excuse of an official inspection to meet with the rebel leaders. He shows considerable signs of sympathy towards the rebels, by the way, which I find rather interesting. The local Imperial commander refers to them as natives, because, well, as far as he's concerned, that's exactly what they fucking are. he has put in place several usual counterinsurgency tactics against them to try and curtail their rampages, shall we say. Zahariel is not particularly pleased about these measures because he considers them to be a bit much. Undoubtedly, he would have argued for just as harsh, if not harsher, measures if it was any other planet, but, well, Zahariel has gone quite native, I suppose would be the correct term, although not quite fitting considering the circumstances. Now granted, you can hardly blame him. After all, this is the world upon which he was born and raised, and many of his knightly ideals must be chafing quite considerably against the more modern sensibilities of the Imperium and the necessity of beating down a rebellion. That is, after all, not a particularly gentle process, and seeing said process take place against your own countrymen, well, that is undoubtedly going to have a certain effect on one's morale. Anywho, after some roundaboutry, Zahariel is brought before a pair of rebel leaders who promptly threaten him with a plasma gun. Rules of parley and all that, I suppose. They wish to take Zahariel as a hostage, but then Zardaviel and the rest of the rebel leadership appear to tell them off. This apparently was not a plan of the rebel leadership as a whole, but rather that of two upstarts. Most shocking of all, however, was that one of the rebel leaders is Master Ramiel, Zahariel's old teacher from back in his days during knightly training at Alderuk. Master Ramiel had left the service of the Order a few years before Luther had returned. He had taken on his final quest, ridden out from the fortress, and had been assumed dead, but clearly not so much. The beast that Master Ramiel had promised to slay was no ordinary beast at all, it would appear, but rather a certain Imperial Aquila. You certainly can't blame the old guy for lacking ambition, if perhaps, maybe, you could blame him for lacking a wee bit of prudence. The leadership of the rebellion, including Master Ramiel, had decided that the Imperium had betrayed Caliban, that they had come as conquerors rather than saviors, and had wiped out all the old and proud traditions of the planet, including those of the knightly orders. As such, as far as they were concerned, the Imperium was an evil to be fought, and expelled from their home planet. It sounds like a rather naive thing, considering the sheer vastness of the Imperium. You have to wonder if these people have even the faintest fucking clue what they're actually fighting, but on the other hand, they could also be considered to be honor-bound to fight against the Imperium and therefore not give a shit about the odds, I do suppose. Although, I have to admit, I do find some of their hypocrisy somewhat distasteful, since they do of course blame the Imperium for all of the bad things that are happening to their people, and ignoring completely the fact that by poking at the Imperium continuously and launching what is essentially terrorist acts upon it, the Imperium has to respond. What the fuck did they expect? Oh, we're just going to shoot down some of your transports and sabotage a bunch of your industrial capacity. You're not going to do anything in return, are you? No, of course it is. You fucking morons. But now that the tiger has been so thoroughly poked, calming it down is probably not a reasonable idea either, and so Zahariel proposes a limited ceasefire. To try and convince them of the need for this, he tells them of the corruption that has taken hold of their planet. Master Ramiel already knows about this, and Master Ramiel and Sardaviel have decided to not tell the rest of the rebel leadership about this small problem, because they, just like Zahariel, knows what the Imperium's solution is going to be. If the rebels thought they were getting fucked now, oh heavens. Oh heavens indeed. They make the assumption that the Imperium would at least try to relocate the Legion and a few 100,000 loyal personnel, which honestly, I think even that might be optimistic, but hey, it's nice to be positive, it's good to be positive. And the rest of the planet would in all due likelihood be glassed, if they're lucky, or simply just broken apart like a fucking toy, if they aren't. But hey, there's no need to panic yet. All that needs to happen now is for the rebels to accept a temporary truce with Zahariel and his men. Then the rebels can use their access to the lower areas of the archaeology to find the Terran cultists, then report their position back to Zahariel, who will send in a kill team to dildo them to death in a most disturbing fashion, and voila, problem solved. No one has to ever know that any of this ever happened. Except, of course, there is a small problem. Because, a wise man once said, things can always get worse. You see, the rebels have been having a wee bit of trouble themselves. They've had several combat teams on the lower levels of the archaeology, 132 men to be precise, and all of them have gone missing. And all of them without so much as a single Vox transmission to warn anybody else. That sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? But hey, it's only 132 corpses. They can't pull off that big of a ritual with just 132 corpses. Oh wait, another one of the rebel leaders also has a pertinent piece of information. 5 million people are currently cramped into the 3 lower levels of the archaeology. An area designed to house maybe 1 or 2 at tops. They have no food, no sanitation, no power, and no clean water. So you can probably imagine that the death rate is quite considerable. And as the remaining population are not particularly fond of living amongst corpses, they dump their dead down the maintenance shafts, leading down to the thermal vent. Oh boy. Okay, we're coming closer to the point where panic might be justifiable. How many people roughly did you say had died already? 10,000! Oh, yes. It is most definitively panic time then. So, the cultists have 10,132 corpses to play with, which they can then turn into undead creatures controlled by reaver worms and send up into the rest of the archaeology, where 5 million people are crammed together like sardines. You gotta give it to the Terran cultists. Considering they've got to be relatively new at this whole cultist thing, they're doing a pretty bang-up job so far. And despite all of this, by the way, Master Amiel is still a bit hesitant about that whole truce thingy. He wishes to have a face-to-face meeting with Luther before he can decide anything properly. Now, one would think that maybe in this situation time would be of the essence, but clearly not. Sure, I'm sure the cultists will take their time and not start their bullshit ritual before you've had a good little heart-to-heart with Luther. I'm sure you've got time for all of this, so snap, snap, Zahariel, it's time to get that shuttle around and get the old man back to Alderuk, and hope that Luther won't punch his fucking face off the moment he sees him. Which certainly is a possibility. Mind you, Master Amiel was of course a very respected member of the Knightly Orders, but he has now pretty much shat all over those oaths and joined the rebels, who have been rather directly attacking the Imperium and the Dark Angels indirectly. He also has some rather choice words to say about the Lion, and whilst the two, Luther and the Lion, aren't exactly on speaking terms at the moment, well, you know how these honourable bros are. They tend to get rather hot and heavy when somebody insults their friends. I'm not entirely sure that this manner of diplomacy is really the most intelligent or worthwhile use of one's time, when a simple vox call might suffice, but then again, the Lion has, for convenient plot reasons, decided to lock himself the fuck away in a basement somewhere, so, you know, I guess he's wandered off from the local vox receiver. Anyways, I'll wrap this episode up here a tiny bit early, just so we can get the last episode also, because it'll probably be a little bit too long to finish up here, but not quite necessarily long enough for an entire episode in and of itself. So, we'll see. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching once again, and I hope to see you all again soon.